Hello, and welcome to Tending the Flame, a podcast that explores the Soul Matter worship theme each month. This month, we explore February's theme of inclusion. So, hello, I am Tony Bianca. I'm the Director of Lifespan Faith Formation, and I'm here with Rev Kristen and Rev Justine to talk about inclusion, our theme for this month in February. I thought we could start by thinking about a time when we may have felt included or even included someone else.
Well, I was thinking about this, something that happened at my home church, the first UU congregation I attended with Dale. We started going there back in the 90s. And they had just called a lesbian minister, which, in 1995 was a pretty big deal. And so we decided to check it out, and there was only one other gay couple there when we started. So we joked that we doubled the gay population by walking through the door.
Percentages.
But then, over time, more and more lesbians started attending, and pretty soon we were in the choir and making the coffee and just, part of the community. And then the minister, after being there for about 7 years, announced that she was leaving. She'd gotten a bigger church. It was a good move for her. But, we were sad, and so we gathered afterwards to talk about how we were feeling about this minister leaving. And this lovely straight man with 2 daughters said, "I'm so afraid all the lesbians will leave."
Oh.
And I just wept at the thought that not only were we tolerated, but we were cherished. And I thought, that's really inclusion, when you can just see people and be delighted that they want to be part of you.
Yeah.
So I remember that story and have shared it often.
Oh. I grew up Catholic, and but very liberally so. I never heard a negative message about my sexual orientation or any sexual orientation for that matter. But it was just unspoken. But I remember very distinctly, I was in the maybe last year of college. One of the priests was wrapping up his time with us, and they did in the petitions, the prayers of the faithful, for that Mass. They prayed for, everybody, different kinds of people, and, they sort of listed, like different races. And it was the first time somebody said, and gay and straight was part of the catalog of different peoples. And I was in the choir loft, and Miss Vic, who was this lovely, one of the little old ladies in the choir loft that sort of created space for me, just under her breath, she said, "That's right." Sort of, an amen. And it was the first time that I realized these people around me who I know care about me really would care about all of me. Like, I don't have to keep part of myself out. There was part of me that wished I had heard that message sooner. But it was really nice, to finally hear it out loud. And it made me realize how little I had heard. In both a good and bad way. That I hadn't heard really anything negative, but I hadn't heard anything positive either. And that's part, I think, of inclusion, is naming it explicitly. Not just sexual orientation, but saying directly, like, all of you are welcome here.
And that it's a plus. It's not like something we put up with, but actually embrace and cherish and celebrate.
Yeah.
It's not tolerance, right? It's celebration.
Right.
I love that idea. It makes me think of so I was raised Catholic and then had kind of left the church. But in my late teens, early 20s, I had started this kind of spiritual seeking. And I asked my friends to just where do you go? Where do you go spiritually? And asked them to take me with them. And one friend took me to Riverside Church, which is in New York. And I just remember walking in, and there were literally people of every age and background. And I didn't know a church like this was possible. And I walked in, and people greeted me, and they were happy to see me. And then I sat down, and the person came up to do the welcome words. And they did this litany. And never before had I been in a church where they talked about welcoming people of every racial background, where they talked about different sexual orientations and identities. And then they said, no matter what class background you come from. And I had been raised working class, and I found myself, weeping. And so there is something about that naming, something about that, welcoming in, that was really powerful. And it was like this first sense I had that like church could be a place that justice making happens. Church could be a place where we could bridge these divisions of identity by being in real relationship with each other. And it stuck with me, right?
Yeah.
I think it planted some seeds about the kind of work for beloved community I do now.
Which is so important. I mean, that's a great kind of shift to think about the time we are in now, where it's like the opposite of inclusion is a bad word.
Yeah.
That some, in the dark of night, people went in and took down portraits and names of LGBTQ folks in government agencies and stripped affirming language from policies, just in a mean-spiritedness that definitely is sending the message that only some are welcome. And so for us to be openly and actively embracing true diversity is a radical act.
Yeah. And I wouldn't have thought, I was going to say who would have thought, but I guess some people did. I just thought we had moved to a point where someone's standing up and proclaiming that diversity is not something they're after, or they're not interested in inclusion feels ridiculous.
Right.
I mean, my head spins at what, I don't know how somebody says that, and what do they mean by that? If not, the horrible things that I think they mean, like what, like what's behind that is not even coded anymore. Yeah, so I wonder if we move that on that track. I wonder if we move from those specific examples of us feeling included to like what does inclusion look like generally? Like how we get at the bigger picture of what makes something inclusive, or how we include people.
I always think about this part of like inclusion in this experience of not having to leave any part of your identity or yourself at the door, right? Because I've heard that too often in church is like, oh, I had to leave this working class part of myself, or this part of my culture, or I had to leave my language, or I had to leave my sexual orientation, right? So that sense of like, in order to be included or to belong, I have to either hide or abandon this part of myself. So to me, full inclusion is that sense of like, I don't have to hide or leave anything behind. And so there's a certain amount of like, can I be my authentic self? And can that be embraced and celebrated? Can we honor that there are similarities between us and our lived experiences, and there are differences, and that we're like jointly learning from each other in that, and that my reality might be different than yours based on the lived experience and identity that I have.
Yeah. I wonder how you build that into a community. I mean, I think that's more a pressure for the two of you as ministers to sort of create a community.
You raised a lot of this in the conversation a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about the future of the campus, and people say we've got to attract more young people. And then if you look at our physical plans and the way we gather and worship, it isn't particularly welcoming to people with maybe shorter attention spans or the need to move. So I think part of being inclusive, is trying to put ourselves in another person's shoes and try some things out, and not be afraid to experiment and say, oh, well, that didn't go so well. We learned from this. Not being so wedded to things being the way they've always been.
Yeah, and I think also doing the most, embracing the most expansive way of doing something. I'm thinking as a cartoon of the, there's all these kids outside of the school, and the school facilities person is sort of shoveling the snow off the steps. And the child in the wheelchair says, like, can you shovel the ramp? And he says, oh, well, when I'm done shoveling the steps, I'll get to the ramp. And the child in the wheelchair says, but if you'd shovel the ramp, we could have gotten in.
Right.
You started there, then we all could have gone in that way. That being inclusive really, sometimes when we focus on including one particular person, we end up being inclusive to everybody. It's a broadening experience rather than a limiting.
And to be open to learning and not take it as like a scolding or punishment. So that, why didn't you start with the ramp? It's like, okay, next time I will. I've learned from this.
Yeah.
And that it's it's a benefit to learn how to be more inclusive.
Yeah, and I was thinking about this concrete example in our faith, which was, we wanted this big social justice umbrella, and we launched this campaign called Standing on the Side of Love.
Oh,
right?
right.
And really huge, powerful, right? We became the people with the yellow shirts, and then we started to hear, right, from folks, colleagues in our movement and members of it, that language felt ableist, right? That it felt like it was only for people who had able bodies that could stand. And so I think about inclusion is that willingness to hear that, to like feel that ouch, and then to like explore together. So what's a way that we could live into this intention that is a wider, that is more expansive, that welcomes more, right? And so we become side with love. And we try to use move language instead of instead of walking language, right? And we're going to do it imperfectly. But are we willing to hear, right? Are we willing to hear because we are going to cause the ouch? Part of that because we're limited sometimes by our own lived experience. And so if we're not willing to hear other people's lived experiences that are different than ours, then we miss that opportunity for broadening our understanding and our ability to truly build beloved community.
Right, if we really mean it, then we have to be open to learning to do it better.
Jason Shelton was here a few years ago talking about that shift in language with the song at the time. I guess Standing on the Side of Love was the name of that song, and we know it now as Answering the Call of Love. I never knew it as Standing on the Side of Love. And so to think of the song with those lyrics, the original lyrics seemed odd to me, like it felt uncomfortable to sing it the original way. Which just reminds me that sometimes when we make those changes, they feel uncomfortable at first. And then I think we get to the point where they feel like the natural thing. It just feels like the way of doing it. To the point where the old way feels odd.
Right, like more inclusive language around gender. That used to be, people would say it with a little attitude, like Ms. or... and now it's just flows and without a thought.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't imagine being somewhere with my husband and like not introducing him as my husband, which even maybe 10 years ago, I would have thought about where I was and, what word do I have to use and figuring out the right word. It was a lot. It's a lot.
Right, and how exhausting is it to have to leave part of yourself outside and be worried about hiding. So, like, all that energy is freed up. I think it was Audre Lorde who said, when you spend energy hiding who you are, you give power to your enemies. And I've thought about that that all that energy is freed up for creativity instead of self-preservation.
Yeah, I'm thinking maybe that's when we talk about the work, we use that word a lot. Like that's what the work of inclusion looks like, that the community takes on the burden of that struggle and all of that, the exhaustive work. So the individual doesn't have to when they come in, they can just be.
Right, so we all use our pronouns and say what they are, so it's not only the people that have non-binary identities are doing that heavy lifting, right? That we can all do that.
Yeah. And another example of something that felt like a struggle at first, I'm thinking of using pronouns. I was very conscious every time I got up to introduce myself of like, I'm saying it. Don't forget to say it. Don't forget to say it. And now it just kind of happens.
And children do it so naturally, and that's really beautiful to see.
All of this is making me think about, right, how important that is in these times, right? I'm thinking about parents who are raising gender nonconforming children or transgender children, and we're living in a culture that is basically saying there's something wrong with that. Right? There's something wrong with supporting our children to be their full selves and to express and live their truths. And it's like, as a faith community, it is like one of my sincerest hopes that we can live into, right? That we can learn how to be a place. That's part of why Tony and I led a service a couple of weeks ago down at South Bay called I Am, which explored different aspects of identity. And one of the stories we used is Julian is a mermaid. And I love this story, right? Because Julian has this experience of seeing these mermaids and then like realizing something about himself. And then this question of like, will his abuela, his grandmother, really accept him. And there's this moment where he like gets dressed as a mermaid and she comes out and she doesn't say anything. And he thinks, oh no, like she doesn't approve. And then she comes back with like her own beads and she puts them around his neck and she takes his hand and she takes him to the mermaid parade, which is this parade that happens in Brooklyn where people of all different gender identities, go out. And I just thought, like, our kids need to know this is possible. That not only will they be their full, like, as they understand themselves, that they will show it, that we will celebrate it, and then we'll say, and come, like, let's go find our community together. And we'll, like, walk hand in hand, or move hand in hand doing that.
Yeah. I can't imagine where we can go that's better than that.
Yeah.
I think that's a great place to say amen. And
Amen.
may we become that community. And thank you, as always, for a great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Until next time.